What are some mysteries science still can't explain? Story 1. The consciousness minimum. How many neurons can we disconnect before self-awareness ceases? There are people with disconnected hemispheres who function, people with lobotomies who function, people with massive surgically extracted portions of gray matter who, if we kept sanding it down to the most necessary bits for just that rudimentary awareness, how small would that pile be? I once read about a guy whose brain matter got slowly eaten away by an illness, like over the course of many, many years. But he didn't notice it because the remaining parts of his brain just overtook the job. As they finally discovered it, there was more fluid than brain matter in his head. Spooky, but also super fascinating. Story 2. How animals perceive time. Dogs use their sense of smell to tell time. They took a dog who would get excited 10, 15 minutes before his owner arrived home and set up cameras. Every day 10, 15 minutes before the dog would spring up and wait at the door. One day they pumped the smell of the owner's clothes into the house all day. The dog had no idea that the owner was coming home till he heard the door. They think dogs use declining smell as a time-telling system. The less they smell the scent, they know the longer it has been, and can even remember exact diminished smells to associate with time. Story 3. There's a lot more medicine that we don't know the exact mechanism of action, but we still give it to people because it gives the desired effects. Edit. As this is getting more attention, I want to clarify that just because we don't know precisely how some modern medication works, please do not reject them, especially in place of homeopathic stuff, without first consulting your primary care physician for your health issue. Billions of funds have been invested into research and development so that we can, to the best of our knowledge, know how to administer them effectively and safely, since we have, for the most part, educated predictions on side effects. In summary, vaccinate your kids. It saves lives. Do not reject modern medication and medicine, especially in place of homeopathic stuff. Consult your PCP if you have questions, not just Dr. Google and Facebook garbage reposts. Story 4. Monarch butterfly migration. It ranks as one of the longest migrations among all animals, from northern US and southern Canada, converging to a pinpoint spot in the Mexican mountains, thousands of miles away. What makes this remarkable is that the generation that leaves Mexico in the spring will give rise to 3 generations on the way north. Each generation dies after mating, and it is the 3rd generation that will travel south in the fall to make it in time to winter over in Mexico. It is not known how they know how to travel thousands of miles south to that very specific place high in the Mexican mountains. How is this information transferred from grandparent to parent to offspring? Story 5. How anesthesia works. We still don't fully understand how it works, yet trust it enough to use it to help in surgery. Well, more in the sense that we don't know how consciousness, so how do you describe a lack of it in a general sense? With respect to general anesthesia, we do have a reasonable idea about how a lot of them work, in that we have a lot of information about the receptors and ion channels that they act on, and specific regions of the brain that they reliably repress. I'd probably describe it more as a lack of knowledge about how consciousness arises, because depending on your semantic definition of work, we do know how a lot of anesthetics work. Story 6. How the first living cell came to be. All cells come from other cells, and all organisms have evolved from single-cell organisms. But what about the first single-cell organism? There's a good bit in Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything that deals with this problem in a bit of detail. Quite interesting learning about how amino acids over time slowly formed chains to make proteins. So you had components that could make a cell. And then those chains hooked up with each other, and some DNA for some reason. And then they figured out how to use the DNA to transfer genetic information through divisions. And hey presto, life that can replicate itself. The book implies that non-replicating protocells had probably arisen multiple times before the replication trick somehow occurred. Story 7. The origin of life on our planet. A lot of people who don't believe in evolution point out that it can't explain where life came from, but that's not the point of the theory of evolution. The beginning of life, the first organism, is an entirely different subject. Several years ago, when I was in college, I read a brief article about scientists conducting experiments on this subject. They simulated the conditions of Earth around the time of the first signs of life and added electricity to something I cannot remember, and ended up with something amazingly like a cell membrane. And then this experiment came along and showed that it may be possible to get all the primary bits, or stuff that makes up those bits, needed for cellular life from a handful of chemicals and UV light. I expect this will be crossed off the list of unexplained phenomena in the next few decades. Story 8. Touch. The most powerful sense we have is the least understood. We researched sight to help cure blindness, hearing, etc. but you literally can't function as a healthy adult if you're not touched and cuddled as a child. We know almost nothing about it, and it literally affects everything. I can feed a baby, cloth a baby, keep them safe, and provide everything scientifically I know they need. But without holding them, they physically will have retarded growth. Their brain will develop with damage. The amazing part? You can undo a lot of that damage if you catch it early by cuddling. You can grow up a healthy, functional person without any sight, taste, smell, or hearing. It's impossible, though, to grow up functional and healthy without touch. Story 9. How words convey meaning. For example, how much of the meaning of a word is in the word itself? And how much of it is from things we know about the world, encyclopedic knowledge? How much of it is inferred from context? Just take a simple word like tree. You're probably thinking of something vaguely tree-shaped right now. Trunk on the bottom, branches, leaves on the top. Now is the fact that trees have branches and leaves information that is contained within the word tree itself? Or is it something you know about trees from having seen them? Consider that not all trees have leaves or branches for that matter. Or context. Say that I say, hey, look at that tree over there. You're probably looking for a tree that stands out in some way. Maybe it's taller or got a weird shape or different colored leaves. In this particular instance, unusual is definitely part of the meaning I'm conveying about this tree. But unusual isn't part of the meaning of the word tree itself, is it? Now think about this. If I say tree, I have a pretty good idea what kind of mental image or idea that word brings to mind in someone else. In fact, that's how I can use the word tree to communicate, because I can kind of guess what tree will call up for you. When I say look at that tree over there, I'm confident you'll have a good idea what sort of object to look for. But it's not like you and I have ever sat down and said, okay, here's what we're going to use tree to mean. Form of plant life, but not a plant or a bush, kind of vaguely shaped like so. Tallish, unless it's young. Made of wood, sap inside, has bark. Might have some leaves or needles on it, unless it's dead or unless it's autumn. And yet somehow we arrive at something that is similar enough in meaning that we can communicate largely without any misunderstanding. Story 10. The Boötes void. It's 330 million light years in diameter, 236,000 cubic megaparsec of nothing, approximately 0.27% of the observable universe. That's 700 million light years away from us. There are a couple of galaxies and stars here and there, but apart from that, there is only nothing. Yes, there are voids scattered throughout time and space. This is actually common and suggests that the theory of matter being evenly distributed throughout the universe because of the Big Bang is true. Unfortunately, this gigantic empty hole in our universe flies in the face of that theory. We've known about this for 3 decades, and we still have absolutely no freaking clue about it. There are many hypotheses and theories, of course. The most outlandish one is that this supervoid isn't actually a void. It's evidence of a cancerous, interstellar species that keeps enveloping stars within Dyson spheres as they expand throughout space. For some, this makes sense since this supervoid is almost spherical in shape, which would make sense if an interstellar species had expanded in all directions from a single point. But this is outlandish and most likely untrue. Story 11. Consciousness, the hard problem of why on earth should all those complicated brain processes feel like anything from the inside? Why aren't we just brilliant robots, capable of retaining information, of responding to noises and smells and hot saucepans, but dark inside, lacking an inner life? And how does the brain manage it? How could the 1.4 kilograms lump of moist, pinkish beige tissue inside your skull give rise to something as mysterious as the experience of being that pinkish beige lump in the body to which it is attached? Story 12. Near-death experiences. Eben Alexander's experience in particular is a good example. Lots of theories have been presented, but there's a much bigger onslaught of unexplainable NDE events that aren't explained by things like that tunnel of light is blood draining away from the eyes, or it's just hallucinations from drugs released by a dying brain. A story about a woman who had a vision of pus in her friend's brain comes to mind. Pus in the brain equals sign meningitis and is eventually fatal. Her friend had no clue she had this, and the ND experiencer had no reason whatsoever to have this vision and didn't even know what pus in the brain meant. She told her friend about the vision, and sure enough, her friend checked herself for meningitis, and she had it. It raises tons of questions, obviously, but it is very far from being fully explained by science. Story 13. There are things we can't know. Metaphysics, the existence of God, multiverse, whether this is a simulation, whether you are the only person conscious, whether this is the Truman Show or Matrix, whether there is such a thing a cause before the Big Bang, things we don't know yet or can't observe, properties of dark matter, etc. Things we haven't bothered to study because it's expensive slash tedious slash of limited value, slash involves too much computation, stuff about endangered species, ancient history, the ocean, relationships between multiple variables, specific minute details like the exact number of precancerous cells in my body, etc. Things related to Heisenberg uncertainty, the exact position and momentum of particles, Schrodinger's problem, things we as individuals are too lazy to understand or can't understand for political reasons and may have subjective consequences, evolution, climate change, politics of exploitation, things that rational reasoning can never convince us, Kantian philosophy, things we haven't had a chance to learn yet, aliens surviving a meteor, rebuilding after a nuclear holocaust, and things that science fails to explain because of human variability and the limits of logic in these fields. Beauty, art, some sociology, grief, morality, cooperation, humor, fun. Story 14. Socks in the dryer. Put a number of socks in the dryer such that you can count at a glance. You will get the same number out every time. Increase the quantity to a number you cannot count at a glance. If you put in an even number of all the same socks, about 1/3 of the time you will get an odd number out. Put in an odd number of the same sock, and you will get the same number out. If you have different colored socks, then you will get on occasion a lower number of even number socks, but never will both socks in the same pair disappear. Science has not explained this, nor has science explained why once in a great while, a missing sock will be found next to the garden gnome. Story 15. Way too late to the party, but I think it's interesting. Scientists still aren't entirely certain what caused the Black Death. We know based on DNA evidence that there were fleas on rats spreading bacteria, and we know that whatever flavor of bubonic plague it was, it is probably extinct, but fleas on rats doesn't account for everything. Temperatures got too cold for fleas when disease was still spreading. The outbreaks spread way faster than rats could have spread it. Some areas had recurrent outbreaks every few years. There should have been loads of dead rats, and there weren't rural and urban areas were all affected, etc. Plus, it's not like the bubonic plague is all that unique in terms of symptoms. So, there are some interesting theories about what else might have been going on, like a concurrent hemorrhagic fever, like Ebola, spreading at the same time as the bubonic plague, or anthrax, or smallpox, or that it was multiple types of plague. Some spread person to person, all circulating at once. So, we know there was definitely bubonic plague or something very like it. And we also know that there probably wasn't just bubonic plague. Beyond that, we don't really know anything, which is pretty bananas when you think about it. I mean, as if bubonic plague isn't bad enough. Bubonic plague plus hemorrhagic fever plus anthrax, all in the span of a few years. What a crappy time to be alive. Although, to be fair, I guess a lot of people weren't alive for very long, so yay. Story 16, I'm a little late, but I hope you find this interesting, OP. There's a plant called a Datura. It contains the three compounds, scopolamine, atropine, and hyoscyamine. These chemicals all have medical applications, but when taken in high doses, usually by ingesting portions of the plant, they cause a fevered delirium state. Absolutely do not attempt to do this because the difference between a recreational dose and a lethal dose is extremely small. Also, anyone who does this says it's extremely unpleasant. Anyway, Datura doesn't operate on the same portions of the brain as other hallucinogens. It works in the brainstem. This makes you believe that everything you see is real. This is interesting in itself. But the unexplainable portion is that almost everyone smokes cigarettes that aren't there when they ingest this plant. Smokers and non-smokers alike will believe they're smoking a cigarette 1 second, and the next, upon realizing it isn't there, will think they dropped it and need to find it before it starts a fire. Story 17. Notice no one has mentioned so. I'll throw out there, but how life began. To clarify, I mean how there was once nothing but the earth itself in its rocky and watery self, and then suddenly we had bacteria, or perhaps something even less. Theories claim that it was likely due to some massive catalyst, like on the tier of a massive meteorite impact. But that doesn't really explain at all how something like that could create life. Something interesting to consider. Let's assume, and this is most likely the case, that the conditions for life to form after such a catalyst are incredibly specific. Now, I'm not one to believe in intelligent aliens out in the universe, at least certainly not alive at the same time as us. But to have any life at all, a suitable planet with just the right conditions is needed, and the perfect catalyst is needed. So say we do discover life on another planet, even if it's just bacteria, that same event most likely happened. If we were to find a planet with very early stages of life, it might actually be possible for us to discover the origin of life by observing recent events, past 10 million years, give or take, that occurred on said planet, such as a massive impact crater, or even something else. This would, of course, be very, very far down the road for our species, assuming it's ever reached, but it's very interesting stuff to consider nonetheless. Story 18. How music connects with emotions? I'm talking in a very specific manner. I'm a music major, and in music theory, I learned so much about how to write good music. Music that's structurally sound, music that flows and makes sense to the ear. Using these rules, I could study and analyze the masterpieces of classical music and copy the techniques, creating my own. However, as far as I can tell, all these rules are solely based on what people think sounds good, and there's no real scientific backing to them, or at least I wasn't told about it. And after all that, what music do people listen to and get the most emotional about? Popular music composed 95% of the same four chords that have been used for decades upon decades. Why? I rack my brains for the answer every day. I wish there was a scientific explanation. Story 19. Why is there more matter than antimatter in the universe? We're pretty sure that each galaxy is practically entirely made up of either matter or antimatter, but not both. This is because we'd see evidence of the two eradicating each other if there was a more even balance. On top of that, we can see galaxies that are currently colliding. If one galaxy was mostly matter and the other mostly antimatter, they'd be giving off a lot more energy than what we're seeing. It's generally agreed upon that during the Big Bang, there was an imbalance between matter and antimatter, but we have no idea why that could be. Story 20. Migraine. Even though it's clear that some genetic predisposition and some environmental factors are at play, it's not quite understood what the direct causes for migraines are. It's hypothesized that neurovascular imbalance is the culprit, that is, sudden changes in neurotransmitter concentrations, and a resulting inappropriate dilation of cerebral blood vessels. But studies have yet to find a definitive causal link. On top of that, we don't quite grasp all the triggering factors for migraines yet either. Our understanding here is better, though. We know a lot of hormonal, physiological, and emotional factors are at play. For example, migraines arise commonly with sleep deprivation, stress, at certain points during the menstrual cycle, and so on. However, there's a possibility we are still overlooking a lot of triggers. And finally, because we don't quite understand migraine pathophysiology yet, drugs aren't quite there yet either. We either have the option to treat migraine attacks with fast-acting drugs of varying strength, or prevention therapy, which means blanket bombing the neurovascular system with beta blockers or anti-epileptics, both of which are riddled with a plethora of side effects. Medicine is actually still in the dark about a lot of things, but this is one hiatus I get confronted with quite often. As a GP, I treat migraine sufferers quite frequently, and it still strikes me as a bit odd each time how I can't really explain why these pains are happening to those patients. Story 21. The Flynn effect. IQ across the world is increasing and has been since IQ was standardized in the 1930s. Psychologists renormalize the tests every few years so that the mean IQ remains at 100 with a standard deviation of 15. When people take IQ tests that were written 3 decades ago, the mean score is above 100 by a statistically significant margin. The effect is even measurable for preschool-age children. A number of possible explanations have been proposed, but no one is exactly sure of the cause of this. Story 22? Well, perhaps too late here, and quite possibly for the best, as I have what I suspect is an unpopular opinion. But it seems to me that scientific methodology has displaced genuine philosophical inquiry. That is to say, inquiry is guided in advance, given over to a set of orienting axioms. Emphasis on the infallibility of metrics has taken over more primordial considerations. A schema of representation becomes promoted as truth in its totality. The danger here, I suppose, is that a layman conception of scientific study has swollen into a naturalized outlook. The neutrality of science is indifferent to its deployment. That is to say, we can't be guided by it without pre-commitments that preclude it. We can employ our technical knowledge in various ways. If we wait for science to rectify everything, we gloss over the strange variance of being human. A good deal is cleansed from the strict methodological outlook. What is the content of 10 seconds, taken in agony as opposed to joy? How do we capture the vivacity of being before the world in a metric? I guess the limitation of science is its inability to authentically capture beings. It runs its course within a useful but limited range. I have great reverence for the results it's procured, but I shudder to think we should suppose it stands as a sufficient snapshot of being, or that such a thing could exist. At any rare, I'm half drunk in a shower and carried away by some weird whim. So I suppose what I have to say and be weary about transposing science into some sort of ritualized practice. Story 23. I've heard that we don't know how bicycles work. The physics say we would fall over to the side. There have been proposed theories, but a bicycle was made that doesn't use any of the principles of those theories and still works. I understand that it's not like massive amounts of resources are being spent to solve this giant problem, nor will the greatest minds of our time ponder endlessly to solve it. But I still think this is kind of funny. It seems something way simpler than questions about consciousness or sleep, which have to do with complicated neuroscience, or why is there gravity, etc. Bicycles should be solved with simple Newtonian physics? No? Story 24. Why do we need sleep? No one really knows. I know we don't have an answer to this. As a recurring insomniac, I've come to a realization on this that if there were no end to each day, even if you were never tired, life would suck. I then thought evolutionarily that time would have less meaning to ancient man. Activities would take longer as we'd have less pressure to do them. Our growth and metabolism would likely slow. Probably would have decreased our survival overall without the time pressure to do things. I don't truly believe this to be the case, but it's an interesting thought. Story 25. There is a great deal that science hasn't explained. That's what keeps millions of scientists working. And not just on big picture stuff like consciousness or the Big Bang and whatnot. Every scientist is working on one or more unanswered questions, the vast majority utterly prosaic. I suspect you're more interested in those big picture questions, questions that seem as if they may not have an answer. Scientifically, there is no clear way to distinguish questions you can't answer from questions you haven't. It's been called the demarcation problem. What questions are beyond the province of science? Even an absolute distinction between science and pseudoscientific claptrap turns out to be harder than you might imagine. Science is plagued by the problem of induction. Yeah, the sun has risen every single day for the last gazillion years, but maybe tomorrow it won't. And then all of your scientific theories go out the window. You can try to exclude the stuff that obviously doesn't work, but there's nothing in science that isn't prone to the occasional experimental error. If you scrapped everything at the first error, you'd have either nothing or a theory so complicated it's as good as nothing. These are boundary pushing conditions I'm talking about here. It's obvious to most people that astronomy is valid and astrology is bunk, but you never quite know for certain. And anything that isn't certain isn't science. So there may always be things beyond the realm of science, but it's equally true that you can't say for certain what those are. Defining an area as without doubt beyond science is so far impossible, and it's hard to imagine what that might be. Science excludes things that are obviously false, like astrology, and in doing so declares them to be of no interest. Story 26. Scientific information will usually only point to the simple knowledge in life. I say simple knowledge because the scientific method is not capable of observing very complex human phenomena since there would be too many caveats. To organize and conduct a scientific study is a challenge. There are just so many forms of influencing a study accidentally that it must be made in a simple way. The study itself will influence the study since it creates an artificial observing environment that is different from phenomena happening in a spontaneous natural world. The nuggets of information are useful, but do not measure a whole process, just a part of the whole. Science is a cool tool for guiding thinking, but more so it is a confirmation that thinking is going in the right direction. Science is not a vault of all the worldly information. It cannot be relied upon to do so because it has major limits. Physical science, things done in a lab like measuring photons or whatnot, can be extremely reliable and valid. But past that, anything involving humans or animals in a study is setting up an artificial setting. The information is still pretty reliable usually, but science is not some magically always correct form of knowledge. It itself will claim that it is not making claims. It is a system of gathering information. But this system of gathering information is making people forget that their brain is also a system of gathering information that can be relied upon. If the brain that is gathering information learns self-discipline and doesn't jump to conclusions too quickly, we can make our own theories in life that aren't based on scientific studies or books. And once in a while, we'll read about a study done on our own theory, and it's a great reassurance we're going in the right path. Or if the results of many studies dictate otherwise, we can question our theories. Story 27. Most of the mass in the observable universe. Oh, and most of the energy too. I'm an amateur at this, so I will do my best to explain. Surely someone will be along to put me right where I go wrong. Mass, we observe galaxy rotation and density being incorrect for the observed mass, adding up all the stars. And by a lot, they should be a lot denser than they are to rotate the way they do. Comparing different galaxies rules out some weird gravity over distance dilation. So the conclusion is that there is unobserved mass in the universe. They name this dark matter, clever ways that they are, and it is calculated to make up 85% of all mass. However, we have never directly detected this dark matter, despite several completed and ongoing experiments to try to do just that. So we have only theoretical ideas about what it might be. WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles, seem to be the physicists' favorite. I rather like the idea that it's shadows of the multiverse. Energy. We observe that the universe continues to expand and, crucially, continues to accelerate. This makes no sense without an external energy, and fake there is no prevailing theory about where this energy is coming from. They call this dark energy. I see a pattern forming here. Story 28. Why are plants green? There's theories, but nothing that doesn't have giant holes in it. For example, you'd think most plants would be black or purple. This absorbs the most light. But most plants are green, directly reflecting a huge portion of light away from them. One theory is that it helps reflect too much light so that they aren't damaged. Issue with that theory is that plants not only aren't exposed to sunlight during the night, but shadows shift and give them less access to light as the day goes on. I'm not a scientist, so I'm forgetting the terms/species, but another theory is that early plant life didn't need green light because it came from the ocean and light gets scattered a lot down there, and some colors penetrate deeper than others. Another theory that's just not satisfying is simply, well, green works enough. It doesn't hurt and they currently live, so green will keep being passed down. So basically, there isn't a reason. It just is. At the end of the day, we literally can't definitively answer why plants are green.